So in the F1 generation, 100% of the offspring produced from a tall and a short plant were tall. And Mendel was kind of wondering, well, how come they're all tall? He knew that each of these plants, out of 100% of their DNA, 50% came from the short plant, and 50% came from the tall plant. So even though that happened, 100% of the plants were tall. So what he decided to do was cross two of the offspring from the F1 generation. So he took the pollen from one of the F1 plants, fertilized the female gametes of a second different F1 plant, and what he saw happen was this outcome. "25% tall, a second 25% tall, a third 25% tall, and 25% short." So he had 75% still tall, but he did have 25%, or 1 out of every 4 plants, turn up short. He called this the F2 generation. Again, Mendel realized that each of these plants, 100% of their DNA, 50% of it came from one parent, and the other 50% came from the second parent. Even in the short one, 50% of this short plant's DNA came from this plant, and the other 50% came from this plant. So why were only 25% of the plants tall? Why were 75%, or why were 25% short? Why were 75% tall? How come they weren't all the same? What he started to realize was that traits can have different variations. So in this case, the trait that he was observing, it was height. And there were 2 variations for height that he saw. Variation 1, tall. Variation 2, short. So he realized that something was in these plants that caused them to have the first variation. Something was in this plant that caused it to have the short variation. He started to realize, going all the way back to the P generation, that since 50% of all the F1 plant DNA had the second variation of short, and also all these plants had 50% for tall, he started to realize that these variations, they are coded for in our genes, in our DNA. And he came up with the term alleles. Alleles are what genes are called for the different variations. And he realized that each of these plants all have to have at least 2 alleles. They all have to have at least 2 alleles. So, going back to the P generation, since 100% of tall plants that were true breeding produced tall plants, he realized that the male gamete had a tall allele, and he gave that an uppercase T. He also realized that the female gamete also had the tall allele. He gave that the uppercase T. We'll come back to why he used an uppercase T here shortly. He also realized that the short plants, they always produce short plants, so the male and the female gamete both had the short allele. He gave those lowercase t's. Had two copies, one from the male gamete, one from the female gamete. However, when he created the F1, he realized that each of these had two gametes, one from the male, one from the female. So that means that from this plant, they were either going to get the first big T or they were going to get the second big T. So all of these plants had at least one big T. Similarly, this plant could only give a lowercase t for short to its offspring. And maybe it was that one, or maybe it was that one. Either way, their second allele was all lowercase. But something happened over here. And this explains why we got a short one. When we crossed this plant with this one, this plant could have passed on that uppercase T or that lowercase t. And similarly, this plant, it could have passed on its uppercase T or possibly its lowercase t. What we know is that the short plant, it could not possibly have had an uppercase T for the tall variation, because if it did, it would have been tall. So we knew that this plant did not have an uppercase T. It only had two lowercase t's. These plants, the 75% that were tall, we know that they had at least one uppercase T, otherwise they would have been short. What we don't know exactly is what the second allele was. It could have been a tall one, it could have been a short one. What Mendel called these upper and lower case alleles were dominant alleles or recessive alleles. Dominant alleles use an uppercase letter. Recessive alleles use a lowercase letter. Dominant alleles are always shown in a trait if a dominant allele is present. And since he realized that the tall variation was dominant, that explains why all of these F1 plants were tall, because they all had the dominant allele from this plant. It also explained why this plant was short. Recessive alleles are only shown in a trait if no dominant allele is present. And that explains why this plant was short. It did not have a dominant allele, so it is short.